Well, hello, dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode in our close reading series of Tolstoy's What is Art? Last week we covered chapter 1 to 4, which states the problem that the book addresses, namely that art, in order to be produced in modern societies, like 19th century, but still relevant today, it demands the mobilization of countless resources and labor, so too much of a sacrifice for an activity that we all consider important, but without providing any justification for its importance. At least an importance that can justify, those sacrifices. So we obviously need to know what art is to see if indeed these sacrifices are worth it. And Tolstoy went through the definitions of art that aestheticians of his time came up with, and we agree that they all converge into one definition, that art is the manifestation of beauty. So we continue today with chapter 5 up to 7, and here Tolstoy is going to give us his definition of art after reading chapter 1 and 2, which are focused on the production of art, on the fact that art requires the coordination and exploitation of millions of workers. Chapter 3 and 4 ask what can justify such practices, notably the fact that this is all done for beauty. Art is defined as the manifestation of beauty, and we've seen everything wrong with that definition, and it's obviously not a good trade-off. I mean, beauty cannot justify the millions of lives sacrificed for it. Plus, it's so confusing as a concept, as no one was able to give a clear definition of beauty. So what then is art if we discard the all-confusing concept of beauty? Well, last week, we've seen in chapter 3 and 4 that some have attempted to provide a definition of art independent of the concept of beauty, some having realized that the aestheticians who try to define art from beauty, they get entangled in all sorts of weird and confusing jargon, no different from theologians and metaphysicians. But while these later aestheticians wanted to get rid of the concept of beauty because of its confusing nature, what they were really trying to get rid of was just the confusion surrounding beauty. But beauty was just the name of another, more basic notion, that is pleasure. I mean, sure, trying to define beauty in some sort of metaphysical or mystic way is confusing, and the aestheticians who exposed this were right to do so. But that doesn't mean that they are different from their opponent if they keep the fundamental aspect of beauty, which is pleasure. All the metaphysicians and mystics of beauty, they aren't different from, the later, more empirical aestheticians, in that they all agree on one thing: art is the manifestation of a certain kind of pleasure that they call beauty. So beneath the metaphysical and mystical notions of beauty lies a certain kind of pleasure that all the later aestheticians share with the metaphysicians. And that's why it's wrong to judge art based on beauty, because we judge it based on the pleasure we get from it. And so here's a quick summary of the views that these later aestheticians, who certainly provided the most comprehensible definitions of art independent of the concept of beauty. Like they can at least be praised for providing less confusing and more comprehensible definitions of art, but yeah, even their definitions won't do. So we can group these definitions into three categories, but they are basically, all the same definition based on pleasure. So you have the physiological evolutionary definition, the practical definition, and the disinterested pleasure definition. So art is an activity already emerging in the animal kingdom out of sexuality and a propensity for play. So that's the views of Schiller, Darwin, and Spencer, accompanied by a pleasant excitation of nervous energy. So that's Grant Allen. This is the physiological evolutionary definition. Or art is an external manifestation by means of lines, colors, gestures, sounds, or words of emotions experienced by men. So that's Véron's definition. This is the practical definition. Or according to Sully's most recent definition, art is the production of some permanent object or passing action which is fitted not only to supply an active enjoyment to the producer, but to convey a pleasurable impression to a number of spectators or listeners, quite apart from any personal advantage to be derived from it. So this is the disinterested pleasure definition. So what's wrong with these definitions? Well, despite their advantage over the metaphysical definitions of art based on beauty, they are still far from precise. So last week we ended the episode on an analogy between art and food. We said that it would be bad to define food based on pleasure, and the same would be true for art. More generally, we said that any human activity should be defined according to its meaning and significance, not the pleasure that we get from it. So meaning and significance, they constitute the essence of that activity, and that should be the basis for all definitions. So to define an activity or a thing is to speak of what constitutes the essence of that activity. So anything else would be imprecise. So to define something based on the kind of pleasure I get from it isn't a definition, because the pleasure that I get from a thing has nothing to do with its essence, with its meaning and significance. So each of these three definitions here, they fall into that trap. The physiological evolutionary definition is imprecise because it speaks not of the activity that constitutes the essence of art, but of the origin of art. The definition by physiological impact upon man's organism is imprecise because many other activities of man can fit into it as well, as occurs in the new æsthetic theories, which reckon as art the making of beautiful clothing and pleasant perfumes and even foods. So two things are wrong with that definition. It confuses the essence of a thing with its origin, and it makes impossible to distinguish between it and other things that aren't supposed to be it. An evolutionary definition of art, for example, will tell you that art is this because people, once they satisfy their desires and physiological needs, they still had other desires to satisfy, but they weren't necessary desires. Like they weren't desires necessary for survival. So we developed activities to give us pleasure just for the sake of it, just to have fun. Like that's the origins of art, the origin story of art. We have like some sort of drive that pushes us towards sex for reproduction purposes, but if you are not looking for sex because we don't need it for whatever reason, but the drive is still there, we convert it into something else. Like, sure, but if we are going to define something by its origin story, then many things that are obviously different become, confused with or conflated with one another because they share the same similar origin story. Defining art by its evolutionary origins leads to say that whatever originated in the same way is art. When we start, cooking for the need of not for the need of food, but simply for the pleasure, to maximize the pleasure of food, then cooking is also an art. And let's be clear about something. Tolstoy isn't implying that cooking or making perfumes aren't arts or cannot be arts. His claim is actually not all paintings, for example, not all pieces of music are arts. And so cooking and making perfumes can technically be art if they fit into the definition of art. But we'll see that in a few minutes with Tolstoy's definition. So the point here is that the pleasure we get, the sensory pleasing reaction we get from listening to a piece of music or when we smell a perfume, they cannot be what define art, even if at their origins these activities were made even intentionally for that specifically. So that's for the first definition. Now moving on to the second one. The practical definition, which supposes art to be the expression of emotions, is imprecise because a man may express his emotion by means of lines, colors, sounds, and words without affecting others by it, and the expression will then not be art. Okay, so the practical definition, that of Véron, argues that art serves a practical function. That is, expressing emotions. People have emotions, but they also have the need to express them. So we require means to do that, and art is the means. However, this definition suggests that whatever someone expresses, like whenever someone expresses an emotion, whatever he used to express it, that means would be art. Now we'll see in a moment why this definition is actually closer to Tolstoy's own definition, but is still inadequate because it leaves out the effect the art has on others. So this definition concerns only the artist and not those who see the art. It's just a way for the artist to express, to purge himself of his emotions, and that's it. So it's still a definition grounded in pleasure, or at least in a practical advantage, getting some emotions out. But again, while it is good to express an emotion, and genuine art, as Tolstoy, will define, doesn't prevent you from expressing emotions, that's still not the essential feature of a work of art. Art can express emotions, but not everything that expresses an emotion is art. And just like with food, it's not a good way to define an activity just from the practical benefit that the performer gets from it. So we get to the third definition now, the one by Sully, disinterested pleasures. So that definition won't do either, even if we take away the practical advantage. We can say, all right, maybe defining art as an activity from which we get a practical advantage or practical pleasures isn't adequate, but we can just define it as a disinterested pleasure, and that still won't do. So he says the third definition by Sully is imprecise because under the production of objects that afford pleasure to the producer and a pleasant impression to the spectators or listeners, apart from any advantage to them, may be included the performance of magic tricks, gymnastic exercises, and other activities which are not art. And on the other hand, many objects that produce an unpleasant impression, as for instance a gloomy, cruel scene in a poetic description or in the theater, are unquestionably works of art. So, as with the other two definitions, the end here, confusing art with other things that aren't art and excluding things that are art. So when we define art by the pleasure we get, disinterested or not, then we suppose that whatever doesn't give us that pleasure cannot be art. However, many objects of art produce unpleasant impressions, as he says. And as for the disinterested pleasures, well, it's not just art that produces them. Magic tricks or gymnastics do that as well, but they're not art. When you watch talent shows, sure, the contestants have talent, they can impress the judges and prove that they are skilled, but magic tricks aren't art, nor do they have to be, in order to be great and enjoyable shows, right? So all these definitions are still imprecise, even though they don't appeal to beauty. In its metaphysical sense at least. Because even though they don't have the flaws of metaphysical definitions, that they feel, more down to earth and less confusing in themselves, they can still make us confuse art and things that aren't art. And that imprecision comes from the same source as the confusing notion of beauty, pleasure. So he says the imprecision of all these definitions proceeds from the fact that in all of them, just as in the metaphysical definitions, the aim of art is located in the pleasure we derive from it and not in its purpose in the life of man and of mankind. So if pleasure obstructs our ability to properly define art, we need to start considering art from another perspective. As a human activity, art has a purpose, but that purpose isn't pleasing humanity. Pleasure cannot be that important to the point we can justify the lives thrown at it and thrown for it. However, that doesn't mean that art isn't important. Defining art, without pleasure, doesn't make our art unimportant, okay? What makes it not important is the art that is massively produced in Tolstoy's Russia and Europe, and also in modern societies. So art that is massively being produced in modern societies has to be abandoned. We need to stop producing art like we do and start producing art aligned with its essence. So we need to define art from its essence, and that is by recognizing how important it is. Art is actually more important than pleasure. Its role in humanity or in human life isn't just to please us. As a matter of fact, art is one of the conditions of human life. So that's how Tolstoy values art, and that's how art is important to Tolstoy. Again, he's not saying that art isn't important and we shouldn't make it. On the contrary, for him, only a few things can be as valuable as art. Without art, there won't be human life. But how so? Well, what's the fundamental aspect of human life? According to Tolstoy, it's communication, or more precisely, it's communion. Forming bonds with other humans is the point of a human existence. Forming communities with others, that's what makes life human. So if art is one of the conditions of human life, then we have to define art as a means of communion among people. Art is therefore a social relation. Every work of art should reflect that relation in which people enter into communion with one another. So this obviously has nothing to do with pleasure. The point of art isn't to please, but to contribute to the creation of communions. That's what it does. The artist who makes the art and the one who receives the work, they enter into a social relation. But the relationship isn't just between the artist and the one who receives the art, but also among all members of the public. The artist doesn't produce art for just one person, but for an audience. But the relationship isn't just between the artist and each member of the audience, but also between the members themselves. If you and I, we attend a concert, we don't just get in communion with the musicians, but also with each other. But the communion is actually broader than even that, because it also stretches not just through space, but also time. I enter a communion with all of those who are watching a play with me and those who watched it before and will watch it in the future, so watch it after me. So I don't just make bonds with people in the present, but also with people from the past and the future. So that's why, according to Tolstoy, every work of art results in the one who receives it entering into a certain kind of communion with the one who produced it or is producing the art, and with all those who simultaneously with him, before him, or after him have received or will receive the same artistic impression. As the word which conveys men's thoughts and experiences serves to unite people, so art serves in exactly the same way. So art is about uniting people, geographically but also historically, through time and space. But Tolstoy says that art isn't the only activity that does that. We don't enter into communion only with art. There are other activities that serve to unite people. So it's important that we don't confuse them with art, right? So art must have a particular way of doing that, specific only to art. So among the means of communication, we have speech, the means of the word. When we talk, discuss, enter in dialogue, we convey our thoughts to each other and thereby we create bonds. But art is different. The peculiarity of this means of communion, which distinguishes it from communion by means of the word, is that through the word, a man conveys his thoughts to another, while through art, people convey their feelings to each other. So this is why I said that Tolstoy's definition is close to Sully's. Sully says that the point of art is to express an emotion or a feeling, whereas for Tolstoy, the point is to convey the feeling. Okay? For Véron, but also Véron and Sully. So the point is to convey the feeling. It's not just to express the emotion or the feeling. You can express a feeling without conveying it, but that's what you are. That's what you're doing, even if you are making a painting, writing a novel, or a melody. That won't be art, if that's what you are doing. In order for there to be art, there has to be a feeling conveyed through the work of art. So expressing feelings, yes, but that expression needs to be received by others. But what does Tolstoy mean by receiving the expression of a feeling? Well, simply put, the activity of art is based on the fact that man, as he receives through hearing or sight the expressions of another man's feelings, is capable of experiencing the same feelings as the man who expresses them. So art as the means to convey feelings means, the means by which I experience the same feeling as the artist. Hence, pleasure is irrelevant. Feelings can be pleasant or unpleasant, that doesn't matter. I, as an artist, can express my joy and make you feel the same joy in the same way as when a man laughs, he makes another man feel merry. Or I express sadness in my art and you feel that sadness too, just like when a man weeps, another man who hears his weeping feels sad. So these are the simplest examples. A man is excited, annoyed, and another looking at him gets into the same state. Art is just, the intentional activity to get others into the same state in which we are. Dancing, acting, playing instruments, singing, drawing, painting, you name it. If they are done with the intention of reproducing a feeling in others and succeeding, then it is art. Or at least good art if it is successful. And that's why I said that technically, cooking or making perfumes can be art if it is done in the same way. If you somehow manage to convey feelings with cooking, well, technically it is art. Art is then not the expression, but the communication of moods, emotions, or feelings. You can express on your own without anyone getting, what you are doing, but communication requires interaction with others. And that interaction, Tolstoy calls it an infection. You get infected with the feelings of the artist. With his movements, the sounds of his voice, a man displays cheerfulness, determination, or on the contrary, dejection, calm, and this mood is communicated to others. A man suffers, expressing his suffering in moans and convulsions, and this suffering is communicated to others. A man displays his feelings of admiration, awe, fear, respect for certain objects, persons, phenomena, and other people become infected, experience the same feelings of admiration, awe, fear, respect for the same objects, persons, or phenomena. On this capacity of people to be infected by the feelings of other people, the activity of art is based. But like I said, this infection must be intentional, because of course, we get infected all the time with the moods of others. The simple examples we provided with laughter and sadness are common. You don't need to be an artist to make, someone else laugh with you. Simply by laughing, those around you will probably laugh as well. So the whole thing surrounding vibes, the positive and negative vibes people, are also based on this infection principle. You can make someone else feel good because you feel good, just like you can make others depressed just by being depressed. But these examples aren't art because they are accidental. If by expressing something, even a feeling, I infect you with the feeling, but without my intention of doing so, like by accident, that isn't art, as Tolstoy says. If a man infects another or others directly by his look or by the sounds he produces at the moment he expresses a feeling, if he makes someone yawn when he himself feels like yawning, or laugh or cry, when he himself laughs or cries over something, or suffer when he himself suffers, this is not yet art. Art begins when a man, with the purpose of communicating to other people a feeling he once experienced, calls it up again within himself and experiences it by certain external signs, and expresses it, by certain external signs. So this, of course, would, make artists, common. You don't need to have high-learned skills, go to art colleges or attend exhibitions and, write critiques about them, or require high stages and whole buildings to make art, or, or be an artist. Tolstoy gives the following example. He says, like, a simple boy who manages to make you feel the same fear that he experienced on, that time when he encountered a wolf, for example, by telling you his encounter, the state of mind in which he was before he came in contact with the wolf, the way he describes the surroundings, the forest, his carelessness, and then the look of the wolf, its movements, the distance between the wolf and himself, and so on. Like, if he manages, by telling you this story, if he relives the feelings he experienced, infects you, makes you relive all that the narrator lived through, as if you, a grown man, even if you are a survival expert and can beat wolves, if by listening to the story of the boy, you feel like a defenseless child lost in a forest and found yourself alone with a wolf, then this is art. Okay, and it doesn't even mean that the story has to be true. It doesn't mean that the boy had to actually meet a wolf alone in the woods. It can be that the boy is lying, but he has just, the fear of seeing a wolf, and so, quote, wishing to call up in others the feeling he experienced, invented the encounter with the wolf, telling it in such a way that through his narrative he called up in his listeners the same feeling he experienced in imagining the wolf. This too is art. So it's not about having the right artistic knowledge. It's not about, having degrees in the history of art. It's not about imitating whatever is considered canon. It's not about, pleasing the right crowd or the references or whatever. It's just about intentionally infecting others. And you can infect them with anything. There is no feeling that when conveyed wouldn't make the work of art, wouldn't make the work a work of art. It can be disgust, it can be fear, it can be hatred, it can be perversion, power, suffering, anger, it can be despair, sadness, depression, none of it matter. The only criteria, a feeling has to be intentionally or purposefully conveyed. So we call it art if a man, having experienced in reality or in imagination the horror of suffering or the delight of pleasure, expresses these feelings on canvas or in marble in such a way that others are infected by them, or he has experienced or imagined the feelings of merriment, joy, sadness, despair, cheerfulness, dejection, and the transition between these feelings, and expresses them in sounds so that listeners are infected by them and experience them in the same way as he has experienced them. Feelings, the most diverse, very strong and very weak, very significant and very worthless, very bad and very good, if only they infect the readers, the spectator, the listener, constitute the subject of art. The feeling of self-denial and submission to fate or God portrayed in a drama, the raptures of lovers described in a novel, a feeling of sensuousness depicted in a painting, the briskness conveyed by a triumphal march in music, the gaiety evoked by a dance, the comically caused by a funny anecdote, the feeling of peace conveyed by an evening landscape or a lulling song, all this is art. Once the spectators or listeners are infected by the same feeling the author has experienced, this is art. So we finally get to Tolstoy's definition of art, and you know its significance if it is written in italic. So he says, to call up in oneself a feeling once experienced and, having called it up, to convey it by means of movements, lines, colors, sounds, images expressed in works, so that others experience the same feeling, in this consists the activity of art. Art is that human activity which consists in one man's consciously conveying to others, by certain external signs, the feelings he has experienced, and in others being infected by those feelings and also experiencing them. So there we have it. This definition is in strike opposition with the other definitions that we've seen last week. It rejects the metaphysical definition of art that says art is the manifestation of some mysterious idea, beauty, God. It rejects the aesthetician physiologist's definition that defines art as a form of play in which man releases a surplus of stored up energy. It also rejects the practical definition that makes art the manifestation of emotions through external signs. And of course, it rejects the pleasure-based definition of art, which, as we argued, permeates the other definitions as well. So art is not the production of pleasing objects, not above all pleasure. So far, so good. But then Tolstoy goes further. He doesn't stop at just, conveying feelings. Remember that the point of doing this is to unite people into communion. So by these standards, the wider the communion, the better the art. As such, if human life is good, and it is defined by the act of entering into communion with other human beings, then the act of forming communion is good for both the individual and mankind in general. Are then, being one of the condition of this act, and this act is good, then art pushes towards the good. But then we have to distinguish between good art and bad art. Good art, as we said, is one that succeeds in conveying the feelings of the artist. But you also have layers of good art. Some works of art are better than others despite, succeeding at communicating feelings. The issue is that some works of art don't reach as many people as other works. The more people you unite, the better the art. And therefore the notion of the good comes back. In the previous episode, we highlighted that there is a distinction to make between the good and the beautiful, and the aestheticians who either, confuse the two or make the distinction but discard the good as the object of art are wrong. So to confuse the good with the beautiful, or to discard the good as the object of art, and thereby, saying that the object of art is just beauty, is to think about art in terms of pleasure. The right way to think about art is through the good, which means the union of people in the same feeling. The good, and therefore, the highest forms of art, is an art capable of uniting the whole of, mankind in the same feeling. If a boy's story can make all humans feel the same feeling as the boy, then it is better, art than all works that manage to only unite limited circles of people. And thus it's better than even the greatest operas or Shakespearean plays or Homeric epics, etc. You can also say that the good is distinct from morality, since it's just about, uniting, a uniting feeling. If fear manages to unite all of mankind, then be it. Works of art don't have to convey morality, just as they don't have to convey beauty. The good is whatever manages to form this communion of mankind. But morality is still involved, and we will get to it in due time. For now, we argue that art isn't like in any of the definitions we've seen so far. Instead, art is a means of human communion necessary for life and for the movement towards the good of the individual men and of mankind, uniting them in the same feelings. So the rest of the chapter continues the analogy between speech and art. The means to communicate thoughts and the means to communicate feelings. What I'm doing here in these episodes is the former. Tolstoy has communicated his thoughts in this book, and which he communicated to the translator, and the translator communicated them to me through his translation, and now I'm communicating them to you. Thereby, you and the other viewers, me, the translator, and Tolstoy, are entering into some sort of communion. We are uniting in the same thoughts, those of Tolstoy, which he got from the thoughts of others. So we can, of course, just repeat them, we can change them, add on to them, build upon them, or reject them, etc. Whatever we do with his thoughts isn't the point. The point is, by reading and discussing his thoughts, we create bonds. We turn our biological lives to human lives. We create communions. And the greater the communion created through a man's thoughts, the greater the thought and the man's words. But that rests on our capacity for understanding those words and those thoughts. Words for Tolstoy are, the form of thought expression. To say that I understand your words means that I understand your thoughts. And that demands a certain capacity. If I can understand your feelings now, knowing that thoughts and feelings are different, they are expressed through different means. Words can express thoughts, but they cannot express feelings. But if I can understand your feelings, then I can understand the means through which you express them. Therefore, there's a different means to express feelings from others, which I also have the capacity to understand. And that capacity to understand feelings is the capacity to being infected by the feelings. To understand what another person feels, I need to get infected by their feelings. And this is how I can create bonds. We need to be able to understand each other so that we can assist one another, transmit past knowledge, send knowledge to the future generation, etc. So we need to be able to understand what those who came before us and live with us are trying to share with us, meaning their thoughts. And just like with being able to understand thoughts, I can communicate those thoughts to others, thereby, being myself a link in the chain that unite humanity through words. Being infected by the feeling of the artist makes me also a link in the chain that unite humanity through art. So we can see a parallel between thoughts and feelings. Concerning thoughts, Tolstoy writes, owing to man's capacity for understanding thoughts expressed in words, any man can learn all that mankind has done for him in the realm of thought, can in the present, owing to the capacity of understanding other people's thoughts, participate in other people's activities, and can himself, owing to this capacity, convey the thoughts he has received from others and his own as they have merged in him, to his contemporaries and to posterity. And so the same is true for feeling. Just like we need access to people's thoughts to form this unity of mankind, we also need access to people's feelings and experiences. Owing to a man's capacity for being infected by other people's feelings through art, he has access to all that mankind has experienced before him in the realm of feeling. He has access to the feelings experienced by his contemporaries, to feelings lived by other men thousands of years ago, and it is possible for him to convey his feelings to other people. And therefore, humanity is united in both thought and feeling. Without these capacities to understand each other, either by understanding each other's thoughts or getting infected with each other's feelings, we won't be able to form social bonds. To understand and convey is the basis for communion. If people didn't, have that, they would be like beasts or like Kaspar Hauser. So, Hauser was a German dude who lived from 1812 to 1833, and he died at 21 years old from stabbing. And he was a weird figure. He could barely speak, and many thought that he was a savage who grew up in the forest and wandered off in the city of Nuremberg, in which he suddenly appeared out of nowhere in 1828. The only thing that he could say was, I want to be a cavalryman as my father was. And so when the police were questioning him, any attempts at gaining more information caused Hauser to cry or simply repeat, I don't know. But he eventually gave them an account of who he is, which only raised more questions. He said that he had spent his youth living in solitary confinement in a dark cell, not knowing why or how he got there, or even by who. He wakes up in the morning and he finds rye bread and water next to his bed. Sometimes he says that the water tasted funny and drinking it would cause him to sleep more deeply than usual. And when he wakes up, he noticed that someone had cut his hair and nailed. Whomever was detaining him, Hauser never knew of his identity, and he claimed that a masked man visited him shortly before his release and taught him to write his own name, how to stand, how to walk, and to say the phrase, I want to be a cavalryman as my father was. And so Hauser claimed not to understand its meaning at the time. So Tolstoy says that without those capacities, understanding others' thoughts and getting infected by others' feelings, we would be like, Hauser or beasts. People would perhaps be still more savage and above all, more divided and hostile. So given that such a life wouldn't be human, nor, even worth living, it's important that the means of conveying feelings be widespread. What is indispensable for creating society cannot be confined to just elite circles or require such sacrifices for just the pleasure of a few. So again, art has to be common. A boy telling you a story that sends shivers down your spine is art. It's more artistic than watching an opera or a movie. In other words, people have been making art since the dawn of civilization. And we don't need all the fancy and expensive shit, the millions in government subsidies to produce it. He says the activity of art is a very important activity, as important as the activity of speech, and as widely spread. As the word affects us, not only in sermons, orations, and books, but in all those speeches in which we convey our thoughts and experiences to each other, so too art, in the broad sense of the word, pervades our entire life, while in the narrow sense of the word, we call art only certain of its manifestations. So art is everywhere, in all classes of society. A poor mother singing a lullaby to her child to soothe him, and as she does, she is feeling the soothing she intends to infect her child with, is an artist. Yes, this is very trivial. It has none of the grandeur or the prestige we are accustomed to when we think of art. But that misjudgment is because of our bad habits. We became, as he says, accustomed to regard as art only what we read, hear, see in theaters, concerts and exhibitions, buildings, statues, poems, novels, etc. But that's not where most of art is being produced. And most of what we take as art isn't even art, since it communicates no feelings or, but just, even if it communicates feeling, it's just for a small minority. And even the ones that manage to communicate feelings, Tolstoy writes, but all this is only a small portion of the art by which we communicate with one another in life. The whole of human life is filled with works of art of various kinds, from lullabies, jokes, mimicry, home decoration, clothing, utensils, to church services and solemn processions. All this is the activity of art. So all of this is art, but because of our bad habits, we narrowed the whole activity of art to just a tiny proportion of it. And it's not even the best part of it. From the entire human activity that conveys feelings, we have singled out just a tiny portion of that activity and call that portion art, like the whole of art, while excluding the rest. Romeo and Juliet or Oedipus Rex, art. The boy's story, the mother's lullaby, not art. Even though both convey feelings, and despite that, the latter examples are better at infecting people. So we call art only that which we, for some reason, single out from all this activity and to which we give special significance. Yep, think of, the stuff you see in great national theaters or is hanging in galleries. Yes, that has a special significance. A woman telling a joke or a group of friends singing folk songs don't have that significance. But why? Well, here Tolstoy introduces another important concept of the book: religious consciousness. You see, for him, what you call art depends on your religious consciousness, or more exactly, how suppressed this consciousness is. Tolstoy argues that art, the activity which conveys feelings, comes from this religious consciousness. But only a small part of this activity receives this special significance. And the significance gives it the title of art in the full sense without realizing that we are actually naming it art in a narrow sense, perhaps the narrowest of senses. He says, the special significance has always been given by all people to the part of this activity which conveys feelings coming from their religious consciousness, and it is this small part of the whole of art that has been called art in the full sense of the word. So obviously that notion of religious consciousness needs, further development, and we will get to that. But let's get something out of the way. The repression of religious consciousness doesn't mean that this mistake of naming only a portion of art, the whole of art, arises from irreligious people or atheists. Now, it's a common mistake for all people everywhere. It's a mistake that people have been making since antiquity, since the times of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the Hebrew prophets and the early Christians, the Muslims, the Buddhists, and by religious men of the people in Tolstoy's time, as well as in our time. So religious people are no exception to this, and they are probably more guilty of this mistake than the non-religious. You never heard of a non-religious individual going as far as explicitly banning all art. Yet it is not uncommon to find such views in some branches of some religions. Tolstoy says that some teachers of mankind, such as Plato in his Republic, the first Christians, strict Muslims, and Buddhists, have often even rejected all art. And although I'd like to point out that it is a misconception that Plato rejected all art. Poets were still allowed in the Republic, but the content of their poetry was extremely controlled and censored. But you can make a case that Plato's views of poetry aren't really that far from Tolstoy's. But that's not why we're here. I would say, however, that if Tolstoy put an emphasis on art aiming at the good, by which he means, the unity of mankind, then he's not that different from Plato. Although he is different in the sense that even though they both recognize art's power to convey feelings and infect people with those feelings, they disagreed in that Tolstoy celebrates that ability to infect, while Plato sees precisely in it the danger of art. And that's why art, especially poetry, has to be, tightly controlled. But anyways, the main criticism that Tolstoy directs at these teachers of mankind is precisely that. They are aware of the ability of art to infect others, and this they claim to be dangerous. But but all they do is suppress one of the fundamental conditions to enter into communion with others. So despite that they are in opposition with the modern view that great art is pleasure, so they agree with Tolstoy in that regard, he disagrees with them when they thought and think that art, unlike the word, to which one need not listen, is so highly dangerous in its capacity for infecting people against their will that mankind would lose far less if all art were banished than if every kind of art were tolerated. So we have here two opposing views on art. One that is old, that regards art as dangerous. The other is modern and regard art as a source of pleasure. But despite their opposition, they converge in that they are both wrong, and that they end up having to squeeze the activity of art, narrowing down so much that they end up, taking just a portion of the whole activity for the entire activity, if they just not, reject it altogether. But Tolstoy holds that the modern error, the modern teacher's error, is far worse than the ancients' error. Those people, he says, who rejected all art were obviously wrong because they rejected what cannot be rejected, one of the most necessary means of communication without which mankind cannot live. But no less wrong are the people of our civilized European society, circle and time, in tolerating all art as long as it serves beauty, that is, gives people pleasure. Formerly, there was fear that among objects of art, some corrupting objects might be found, and so all art was forbidden. Now, there is only fear lest they be deprived of some pleasure afforded by art, and so all art is patronized. And I think that the second error is much greater than the first, and that its consequences are much more harmful. So, those who fear infection went as far as banning all art to avoid the works that can infect people with corrupt feelings. Let's say, while those who value pleasure started considering anything that brings them pleasure as art, and supported, demand more of it, even if it means throwing millions of lives for it. So, this modern view is perhaps more dangerous and harmful in the eyes of Tolstoy. But if these mistakes have spread since forever, well, we need to explain them, right? Like, why do people make such false judgments on art, which is supposed to be a fundamental activity, like a condition for human life? Well, chapter 6 offers an answer. And it's going to focus not on how the ancients made their mistake, but how the modern made theirs. Because given that the modern's mistake is worse, and the ancients would never, conceive of its legitimacy, then obviously the modern one should worry us more. If Tolstoy had to, choose between either rejecting all art, or at least, submitting it to immense censorship out of fear of its infecting ability, or accepting whatever pleases us is art and celebrating it, well, I think Tolstoy would consider the former as a lesser evil and so accept the former. So we're going to focus on that first, on how could it happen that the same art, which in antiquity was either barely tolerated or altogether rejected, should come to be regarded in our time as invariably a good thing, provided it affords pleasure. And here the notion of religious consciousness is key. So let's start from the beginning and ask what makes people appreciate art, by which we mean what makes people appreciate the feelings that art conveys. Obviously, if art is the means to communicate feelings, if we, appropriate art, then it simply means that art is communicating the feelings that we wanted to communicate, okay? If we appreciate, appropriate. If we appreciate art, it simply means that, art is communicating what, the feelings that we want it to communicate. So we appreciate certain feelings. So how do we come to appreciate certain feelings and not others? Well, that depends on our understanding of the meaning of life. And what is the meaning of life? Well, it's what we see as good and evil in life. So to say life has meaning means that I have a distinction between good and evil. A life is meaningful if it fits with what is considered good, and meaningless when it fits with what is considered evil. But then the question becomes, what determines good and evil? And according to Tolstoy, good and evil in life are determined by what are called religions. So religions determine good and evil, which determines the meaning of life, which determines which feelings to appreciate, which determines which art to appreciate. So if we take a shortcut, religion determines how we appreciate art. So here we need to understand how religions are made, how they come into being. And Tolstoy offers the following theory. So it starts with what he takes as a fact, that is, mankind ceaselessly moves from a lower, more partial and less clear understanding of life to one that is higher, more general and clearer. So we as humans, we start from a place of vulnerability because our understanding is limited and want to get, to a place of invulnerability where our understanding of life is more reliable. So this is a movement from one place to another. Given that it is a movement, Tolstoy says, like all movements, it must have leaders. And what is a leader? It's someone who understands the meaning of life more clearly than others. So it is someone who is advanced, like an avant-gardiste. They have a clearer idea of that higher place, a clear idea than you have. And so they will lead the way, showing you where to go. Now, movements have generally many leaders, but usually one of them is going to stand out. He's more avant-garde than others. So he seems to know better than the other what the meaning of life is, and he manifests this meaning through his words, deeds, or being. This one, Tolstoy says, in his words and in his life, has more vividly, accessibly, and forcefully manifested this meaning of life. A religion is then created around this man, and the meaning of life he manifested took everyone by storm. So Tolstoy defines a religion as the conjunction of two things. This man's manifestation of this meaning of life, together with the traditions and rites that usually form around the memory of such a man, is called religion. Religions are indicators of the highest understanding of life accessible at a given time in a given society to the best of the leading people, which is inevitably and unfailingly approached by all the rest of society. And only because of that, religions have always served and still serve as the basis for evaluating people's feelings. If their feelings bring people closer to the ideal to which their religion points, agree with it, do not contradict it, they are good. If they move them away from it, disagree with it, or contradict it, they are bad. So that's Tolstoy's definition. In the movement to get to the higher place, a man shows up and, being more illuminated than others, gives them an ideal. The realization of that ideal is the realization of life's meaning. So you take that ideal and introduce practices to never forget about the man who brought, the ideal, and perhaps more importantly, never forget about the ideal itself. So practices for the purpose of promoting the ideal and the memory of those who brought the ideal or, impersonated it through their lives, through, their way of being in a given society, that is called a religion. So the higher place is the ideal, and thus you call good the ideal itself and whatever gets you closer to it, and bad or evil the opposite of the ideal and whatever moves you away from it. And this doesn't exclude feelings, since they either get us closer or further away from the ideal. So we have good feelings and bad feelings depending on how close or away they get you from the ideal. So here are a few examples that Tolstoy, gives. In Judaism, the meaning of life is the worship of the one God and the fulfilling of what is regarded as his will. So whenever art conveys the feelings resulted from the love of this God and his law through the sacred poetry of the prophets, the psalms, the stories in the book of Genesis, then it is good high art. If art conveys the feeling of the worship of alien gods or feelings discordant with the law of God, it would be regarded as bad art. In Greek religions, life has meaning in earthly happiness, in beauty and strength, then art that conveys the joy and zest of life will be considered good art, while art that conveys feelings of delicacy or dejection will be bad art. Roman and Chinese religions place meaning in the good of the nation or in continuing the way of life of the ancestors and revering them. So art that conveys the feelings of joy in the sacrifice of personal good for the good of the nation or the glorification of the ancestors and the maintaining of their tradition will be considered good art, while art that expresses feelings contrary to these will be considered bad. In Buddhism, meaning lies in liberating oneself from the bonds of animality. Then art that conveys feelings which elevate the soul and humble the flesh will be good art, and all that conveys feelings which enhance the bodily passions will be bad art. So this is simple, right? The common meaning, this ideal that religion places in certain things and is held in communion by the members of a given society, is the religious consciousness that we mentioned earlier. By this we mean that individuals have an awareness of a certain ideal to follow for the fulfillment of their lives, to manifest that meaning like the leader who brought it did and exemplified. So such awareness is a religious consciousness. Given that this consciousness only makes sense in societies, that is, an individual who lives isolated, like Hauser or like a beast, with no contact to the rest of mankind, will probably never develop a religious consciousness. He'll have no ideal, he'll consider no movement from the inferior place to a superior place. So this consciousness only arises in the formation of society. And societies only arise when there is a disposition towards that consciousness. There cannot be society if there is no religious consciousness. So there cannot be a society without an ideal, without a notion of what is good and what is bad. Always, as he says, in all times and in all human societies, there has existed this religious consciousness, common to all people of the society, of what is good and what is bad, and it is this religious consciousness that determines the worth of the feelings conveyed by art. So with this, we can just say that whatever is considered good art is an art that conveys feelings resulting from religious consciousness, since the religious consciousness determines the ideal. So from the previous sentence, we conclude, and therefore, always in all nations, art that conveyed feelings resulting from the religious consciousness common to the people of the nation was recognized as good and was encouraged, while art that conveyed feelings discordant with the religious consciousness was recognized as bad and was rejected. The whole enormous remaining field of art by which the people communicated among themselves was not valued at all and was rejected only when it ran counter to the religious consciousness of its time. So it was among all nations, Greeks, Jews, Hindus, Egyptians, Chinese, so it was too when Christianity appeared. So Christianity enters the picture now, and this is going to be important for Tolstoy. Being a Christian himself, he is going to single out Christian art as exceptional despite sharing the same consciousness as the other religions. So at first, Christianity emerged following the same process he just described. You obviously had the leader, Jesus, who brought an ideal. That ideal became the object of the religious consciousness of a certain society. So like all nations, Christians said that there's good art and there's bad art. The former gets us closer to the ideal set by Christ, the latter gets us away. And as such, Tolstoy says, it's no different from, the Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and pagan religions. He says, Christianity of the earliest time recognized as good works of art only legends, saints' lives, sermons, prayers, hymns that called up in people the feeling of love for Christ, of being moved by his life, the desire to follow his example, the renunciation of earthly life, humility, and love for others. All works that conveyed feelings of personal pleasure were regarded as bad, and therefore Christianity rejected all pagan plastic art, allowing only symbolic plastic images. Now, before moving further, I'd like to stress that all arts produced By all the nations here are true art, since they all convey feelings. It's also important to know that religions aren't monolithic. They change through time and space, and as such, the same religion will have different types of work of art depending on the period. The same religion can at one point consider painting portrait, for example, as good art, since it judges that medium as appropriate to convey the feelings that it considers good, while at another time that same religion can consider painting portraits as no longer conveying good feelings and therefore ban it. So this doesn't change the status of those works of art as genuine art. Both the good and the bad art here are genuine art since they convey feelings. Pagan art in relation to Christian art is still genuine art since it conveys feelings by Tolstoy's standards. It's just not the kind of feelings Christianity sanctions. So Christianity can change its views of art if at its first centuries it appreciated certain works of art and disapproved others. In subsequent centuries that can change and become the reverse. What was appreciated, let's say, in the first centuries becomes disapproved, and what it used to disapprove can become, appreciated. But both are genuine art. And that's precisely what happened, as Tolstoy points, that early Christianity promoted a different art than the one that came after the conversion of many nations, notably European and Russian nations, to Christianity. Before the conversion, Christians of the first century who received the teaching of Christ, if not quite in its true form, still not in a perverted one, not in a pagan form, such as was accepted later on, they used to reject, pagan art and had an art different from the one that began to spread after the conversion. The series of conversions that marked the end of antiquity and the beginnings of the Middle Ages, those conversions by a ruler's decree, as under Constantine, Charlemagne, and Vladimir, witnessed a transformation of art. So Prince Vladimir I of Novgorod, he adopted Christianity as the religion of all his people in 988, as the Emperor Constantine and Charlemagne they had done earlier for their peoples, respectively in 313 and through the 8th century. So these conversions weren't peaceful, and they were, forced by the emperors onto their subjects through bloodshed. So once the conversion's done, Tolstoy says, there appeared a different Christianity, a church Christianity, closer to paganism than to the teaching of Christ. So from early Christianity, which was more faithful to the teachings of Christ to some extent, we move to church Christianity. And for Tolstoy, this affected art. Church Christianity had a different teaching from Christ's, and on the basis of its own teaching began to evaluate quite differently the feelings of men and the works of art that conveyed them. So the basic and essential thesis of true Christianity were the direct relation of each person to the Father, and following from that the brotherhood and equality of all men, resulting in the replacement of all forms of violence by humility and love. Church Christianity recognized none of these. Instead, its teachings center on hierarchy, personal cults, worshipping individuals, martyrdom, and superstition. So he says, an established heavenly hierarchy similar to pagan mythology and the worship of it, the worship of Christ, the worship of the Mother of God, of angels, apostles, saints, martyrs, and not only of these divinities but also of their images. Church Christianity set up blind faith in the church and its statutes as the essence of its teaching. So there is nothing Christian, argues Tolstoy, in the teachings of church Christianity. But he still contends that it remains better for the barbarians who embraced it because it is a loftier teaching than their former worship of gods, heroes, good and evil spirits. A little bit condescending, but alright. So I guess that it's better to worship one god than many martyrs and saints instead of heroes and angels instead of spirits, but whatever. Better Constantine than Julian. right? Julian, known as the apostate, was a Roman emperor from 361 to 363, and he attempted to restore paganism in the Roman Empire. So Tolstoy is like, church Christianity, that's good only for the pagans, like it's a better version of paganism, but it's only for barbarians, not for us true Christians who understand the truthful truth of Christianity. But the point is, the moment with this new version of Christianity, art was now evaluated differently. From then on, art that portrayed the pious veneration of the Mother of God, Jesus, saints, angels, blind faith in and obedience to the Church, fear of torments and hope of bliss in the life after death was considered good. Art opposed to that was considered bad. But as we said, although the Church was censoring art, promoting the art that promotes its own ideal, while rejecting the one that doesn't, even though the rejected art promoted more the original or true ideal of Christianity. So despite that, art promoted by the Church was, well, technically still true art. The teaching on the basis of which this art emerged was a perversion of the teaching of Christ, but the art that emerged from this perverted teaching was still true art, because it corresponded to the religious worldview of the people among whom it emerged. So this is very important in Tolstoy's theory of art. For art to be art, you need at least a religious worldview shared by a society, and art must correspond to it. Given that art is when an artist infects others with his own feelings, the artist himself must feel, or at least has felt, the emotions he or she seeks to infect others with. So the artist must also share the religious worldview of society for that art to be, true art. If there's a divergence between the feelings he tries to convey and the religious worldview of the people he tries to infect, his art won't be true art and will, most likely fail. And likewise, if he doesn't feel the feelings that his art infects others with, then it's not true art either. In this sense, if the Church asks from a certain artist to produce a work, but just as propaganda, meaning that he himself, the artist himself, doesn't share the Church's worldview, but he's told to trigger the kind of feelings that align with the Church's teachings, and he does it without feeling the feelings he triggers himself, that's not true art. So artist feels feeling X and infects the audience with feeling X through his art. That's a true work of art. And so if the art produced during Church Christianity is true art, it means that both artists and their targeted audience experience the same feelings. Therefore, they have the same religious consciousness or religious worldview. So even if the Church's teachings are perverted, that art is still true art. The artists of the Middle Ages, he says, sharing the same religion with the popular masses as the basis for their feelings, while conveying in architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, and drama the feelings and moods they experienced, were true artists, and their activity based on the highest understanding accessible to that time and shared by all, though low for our time, was still true art common to the whole people. So this was the standard. Even if the Church calls the tiny portion of the art that it promotes the whole of art, thereby excluding most works of art simply because it doesn't fit with its teachings, that small portion is still true art nonetheless. How then did we move from that to modern art, to an art based solely on pleasure instead of communicating feelings? So he says it started when the upper, wealthy, and more educated ranks of European society started to doubt of the truth of the understanding of life expressed by Church Christianity. That doubt, of course, didn't come from nowhere. It came as a reaction to the actions of the Church. After witnessing the Crusades, after papal power became highly developed and likely abused, people started to doubt, the legitimacy of papal authority and therefore the Church. So we're getting close to the Renaissance here, in which ancient wisdom from antiquity resurfaced, in Europe, and the disenchanted elites, defiant towards the church, even towards the knowledge sanctioned by the church, they turned away from it and started getting more familiar with ancient wisdom. So two consequences result from this. The upper classes saw, on the one hand, the reasonable lucidity of the ancient sages, and on the other, the lack of correspondence between the church's teachings and the teaching of Christ. So it became impossible for them to believe as before in the teaching of the church. So slowly, their skepticism grew. Even if they didn't cut ties with the church's teaching, their relationship with it grew simply formal. In reality, they were no longer able to believe in it. And if those teachings remained in place, unchallenged by the upper classes, it was simply by inertia, like just out of habit or tradition, or for the sake of the people who continued to believe blindly in the teaching of the church. And because they, the upper classes, thought that it's in their interests that those blind beliefs of the masses were maintained. But soon enough, the church found itself losing its power and authority, and so its teaching ceased at a certain moment to be the general religious teaching of all Christian people. So the church found itself in a precarious situation. It found itself torn between, on the one hand, the upper ranks, the growing bourgeoisie, those in whose hands lay the power and wealth, and therefore the leisure and means to produce and encourage art, and on the other, you had the people who went on blindly believing in its teaching. So that moment was obviously important. Since the church was losing momentum and power over the upper ranks, it also began losing its control over art production. Since much of the art produced in that period was funded by the wealth of the upper ranks, the moment they started breaking off with the church, they started funding art more aligned with their interests than the teachings of the church. However, since art is supposed to convey feelings determined by a worldview, a religious worldview, a worldview of good and evil, then the art competing with the church's art had to convey the feelings of these upper ranks and their artists. But what conception of good and evil do they have? What feelings do they convey? And this was the problem. According to Tolstoy, they had none. Their situation already mirrors that of the educated Romans before the appearance of Christianity, that is, they no longer believed what the people believed. The upper ranks in Roman society lost faith in their god emperors and household deities, contrary to the rest of Roman people, just like the upper ranks of the Middle Ages lost their faith in the church and papal authority. But there's a significant difference between the Roman upper classes and the European upper classes of the Middle Ages. The Romans, having nothing more to extract from all the complex mythology they had borrowed from all the other peoples they had conquered, well, they had to find a substitute to fill the vacuum. So they had to embrace an entirely new worldview. Seeing the growing sects of Christianity, they embraced it, and thereby finding a new worldview to replace their old pagan worldviews. So the people of the Middle Ages were in a different situation. They had no new worldview to replace the church's worldview. They themselves had no belief that they could put in place of the obsolete church teaching, which had lost its meaning for them. But this wasn't much of a problem because also, contrary to the Romans, the people of the Middle Ages, who doubted the truth of the Christians' Catholic teaching, did not have to look for a new teaching. So they didn't have to bring something new, actually. This is the biggest difference between them and their Roman predecessors. The Roman had already exhausted everything in their mythology, so they cannot bring back past beliefs or revitalize any. This wasn't the case for Christians. The upper ranks had the true, teachings of Christ before its perversion by the church available to them. Tolstoy argued that had they brought back those original teachings of Christ, things would have probably gone better. The church's teachings weren't, going anywhere anytime soon anyway, so they didn't have to look for a new worldview. Just take that church teaching and dig up, the original teachings by Christ underneath it. They had only to discard the perversions that obstruct the teaching discovered by Christ and to adopt it, if not in all, then at least in a small part of its meaning, greater, however, than that adopted by the church. So, and indeed, still according to Tolstoy, many have launched such enterprise. Protestantism was such an attempt to expose the abuses of the Catholic Church and reclaim the original teachings of Christianity. Among the central figures of Protestantism, or the Reformation, you have John Wycliffe and John Hughes as early church reformers and predecessors of Protestantism, but both, having thrived in the 14th century. Then, of course, in the 16th century came the big names, Martin Luther and John Calvin. But even before the Reformation, you had the whole movement of non-church Christians, represented in early times by the Paulicians, the Bogomils, and later the Waldensians. So these were all classified as heretic movements by the church. The Paulicians were a heretical Manichaean sect found in Armenia in the 7th century. Its name is derived from Paul of Samosata. He was a 3rd century bishop who stood up to the authority of the synod, but the sect was eventually defeated by the Greeks in 872, and they were exiled to the Balkan Peninsula. The sect of the Bogomils and Waldensians, they held much the same ideas as the Paulicians. All of them and many others were non-church Christians, so the so-called sectarians, and they all rejected church dogma and authority. However, much of these movements, they didn't last because, the church was too powerful and the number of non-church Christians was relatively small. But the most important reason why they didn't stand a chance against the church, they were, mostly led they were mostly led by people from the masses. It was done by poor people, not the powerful. So the only few among the rich and powerful who made attempts to defy the church, like Francis of Assisi and others, who accepted the Christian teaching in its vital sense, saw their advantaged position destroyed. In short, the upper classes, they didn't stand up to the church. And the reason they didn't was precisely because they didn't want to lose their advantaged position, which they were going to lose anyways. If it wasn't the church that takes it away, it would be the genuine teachings of Christ, since true Christianity is incompatible with having, advantageous positions. In short, the upper classes didn't want equality among all mankind. They wanted to keep their privileges in the hierarchy. So he says, the majority of people of the upper classes, though at the bottom of their hearts they had already lost faith in the church's teaching, were unable or unwilling to do so because the essence of the Christian word outlook they would be adopting if they were to renounce the church's faith was the teaching of the brotherhood and therefore the equality of men, and such a teaching would deny them a prerogatives by which they lived, in which they had grown up and been educated, and to which they were accustomed. So they didn't want to believe in the church anymore, but didn't want to believe in the true Christianity either. So they kept embracing the church, since the church's teaching justify their position, whose existence is incompatible with actual Christianity. But since it was only for the position, they didn't really care, nor they believed in the church's teaching. And as such, the consequence is you end up with a class of people with no religion. He says, at the bottom of their hearts, they do not believe in the church teaching, which had outlived its time and no longer had any true meaning for them. And since they were unable to adopt true Christianity, the people of these wealthy ruling classes, the popes, kings, dukes, and all the mighty of this world, were left without any religion, with nothing but its external forms, which they maintained, considering it not only profitable but necessary for themselves, since this teaching justified the advantages they enjoyed. Essentially, these people did not believe in anything, just as the educated Romans of the first century did not believe in anything. And yet, the power and wealth were in their hands, and it was they who encouraged art and guided it. And so it was among these people that an art began to grow up, which was evaluated not by how well it expressed feelings resulting from the people's religious consciousness, but only by how beautiful it was. In other words, how much pleasure it afforded. So in short, they didn't have anything to fill the void, they had no religion to believe in, and as such they appealed to the only thing that they know, the only thing that they know that can give them meaning, which is pleasure. So with their wealth, they continued their luxurious existence as they usually did before, as patrons of the art. But with the freedom, power, and wealth that they enjoyed, they promoted an art like no other before. An art solely based on pleasure. Art as beauty is now born. And so caught between a religion in which they no longer believe, the church religion, which had betrayed its own lie, and a second religion in which they cannot believe, the true Christianity, which denied their entire life, well, they had to opt for an option. They eventually returned to a worldview, one that is irreligious and even hostile to religion, a pagan worldview. So these wealthy and powerful people, being left without any religious understanding of life, returned willy-nilly to that pagan worldview which locates the meaning of life in personal pleasure. Thus, there occurred among the upper classes what is known as the Renaissance of science and art, which essentially was not merely the denial of any religion, but also the recognition of its needlessness. So some can ask, why didn't they try to amend the Roman Catholic Church? Why didn't they, why did they have to just believe in it entirely? And the answer is that, according to Tolstoy, at least, the teaching of the church is such a coherent system that it cannot be changed or corrected without destroying the whole. So this isn't something that you can amend or cherry pick what cherry pick what to keep and what to discard. It's a whole package deal. You either accept everything that comes with it, or you reject everything. So the moment you start doubting it, or doubt it, the highest authorities, their knowledge and expertise, it's game over. One thing that cannot be doubted, for example, is the infallibility of the popes. Once you contemplate the possibility that the Pope is wrong or doesn't know what he is talking about, the whole system comes crashing down. And according to Tolstoy, that's what happened. The upper classes, all educated people, started having doubts about the Pope's infallibility. Although at note 55, Pevear says that Tolstoy's chronology is mistaken because papal infallibility was declared dogma only in 1870 by Pius IX. So there's a bit of an anachronism there, but it doesn't change much, his claim that in the upper classes there inevitably emerged a doubt of the truth of Catholic tradition. And doubt of the truth of the Catholic tradition demolished not only the papacy and Catholicism, but the entire faith of the Church. With all its dogmas, the divinity of Christ, the resurrection, the Trinity, it also destroyed the authority of the Scriptures because the Scriptures were recognized as sacred only because tradition had decided so. So everything in that system would be doubted by most people. So it required an authority that must remain unchallenged and that people must believe to be, infallible, like they can never be mistaken. The Trinity, the divinity of Christ and his resurrection, no one with common sense would believe in them and take them seriously. Jesus never claimed to be divine, or that God is three, or that, he died and literally came back from the dead. Those were superstitious accounts. But if the Pope believes in them and tells me that they are true, then I guess they must be. But once you don't take whatever the Pope says for granted, it's only a matter of time before you see that the church is full of, it's full of shit. Tolstoy goes as far as putting popes and clerics among those who don't believe in the church's teachings. Like even the highest authority, the papal authority, knows that it is all bullshit. So the majority of upper class people at that time, even the popes and clerics, essentially did not believe in anything. They did not believe in the church teaching because they saw its unsoundedness, nor could they recognize the moral, social teaching of Christ as it had been recognized by Francis of Assisi, Peter Kolokhonsky, and most of the sectarians, because this teaching would destroy their social position. So these people remained without any religious worldview, and having no religious worldview, they could not have any other standard for evaluating good and bad art than personal pleasure. Having recognized pleasure, that is beauty, as the standard of what is good, people of the upper classes of European society returned to their understanding of art to the crude understanding of the primitive Greeks already condemned by Plato. And in correspondence with this understanding, a theory of art took shape among them. So now we've seen the history of how this notion of art defined by beauty and the theory, that art is the manifestation of beauty, therefore any good art is whatever works that are, beautiful, came about. So he says, since the time when people of the upper classes lost their faith in church Christianity, the standard of good and bad art has been beauty, that is, the pleasure afforded by art, and in correspondence with this view of art, an aesthetic theory has taken shape of itself among the upper classes, justifying such an understanding, a theory according to which the aim of art is the manifestation of beauty. So there the standard is no longer to infect others with the artist's feelings, but simply to please them. If a painting, a play, novel, building, music or anything else, the sensation of a piece of cloth on the skin, the smell of perfume, the taste of food, if all that pleases me, then the painting or the food is beautiful and therefore it is art. So this is the basis for this new aesthetic theory of the disenchanted upper classes of the Middle Ages. But this theory wasn't entirely new either, like it didn't pop up from a vacuum. Its adherents wouldn't have been taken seriously if they had bluntly affirmed that beauty is the basis of art without theoretical support. So given that they cannot draw from support from Christianity, whether true or church Christianity, they return to the ancient Greeks, so to pagans. They say that what they are affirming isn't something that they invented, but it was already known by the sages of the ancient world. So in their attempt to confirm the correctness of their view, of their theory, they assert that it wasn't invented by them, but that it lies at the essence of things that was already recognized by the ancient Greeks. However, if we are talking about the Greeks, we already said that even the Greeks rejected the idea that what makes art, and more precisely good art, is pleasure or beauty. Plato, for example, we've argued ferociously rejected such a worldview. So to attribute to the ancient Greeks the theory that good art is just beauty, that what pleases the senses is beauty, that's completely arbitrary. The only support for this claim that good art is just beauty is the fact that for the ancient Greeks, he says, with their lower moral ideal as compared with the Christian, the idea of the good, to agathon, was not yet sharply distinguished from the idea of the beautiful, to kalon. Other than this fact, there is no evidence that the Greeks embraced the aesthetic theory of the late Middle Ages upper classes. And it's not even good evidence because the upper classes are actually distorting that claim. Tolstoy's theory of art argues that there is a sharp distinction between the good and the beautiful, between to agathon and to kalon. But the ancient Greeks, they didn't make the distinction that sharp, meaning that for them both notions overlap and can be synonymous if we are careful enough with terminology. Like the good for the Greeks is always beautiful, but what people take to be beautiful isn't always good. So for beauty to become synonymous with the good, that requires knowledge of the good. The sage, he who has wisdom, meaning who knows the good, if everything that he sees and judges as beautiful is undoubtedly also good. So you can say that for the Greeks, they acknowledge only one notion of the good, but there can be different meanings of the beautiful. One is bad because it's unconnected to the good and can be dangerous because it can make us believe that we know what is good when in fact we don't. The other is promoted because it's indeed identified with the good. So in short, the good is always beautiful, while the beautiful is always good only in the eyes of the sage. So the upper classes, however, distorted this wisdom. Even if they embraced it at first, their theory slowly deteriorates into precisely what that ancient wisdom warned against. To think that art is whatever is beautiful, or to think that whatever is beautiful is good. So that's the danger of thinking that there is a necessary link between the two notions. Even the highest forms of ancient Greek wisdom was vulnerable to that danger of judging, the good by the standards of the beautiful, even if it tried not to. So by believing that the good has to be the beautiful, instead of like Tolstoy arguing about the good can be beautiful but doesn't have to be, their conception of the good remained limited, and their views of art remained based on pleasure. And unless they eventually transcend this relation between the good and the beautiful, it was probably just a matter of time before what they feared most becomes a reality. The Greek philosophers saw that their society was taking the good as whatever pleases them, and they expressed skepticism about it, but they only went so far as subordinating one notion to the other. And this is in complete opposition with the teachings of the Jews and Christians, both insisting that there is no intrinsic relation between the good and the beautiful, even going as far as saying that the closer you get to the perfection of the good, the further you move from the beautiful. So he says, the highest perfection of the good, not only not coincident with beauty, but mainly opposed to it, which the Jews already knew in the time of Isaiah, and which was fully expressed by Christianity, was completely unknown to the Greeks. They thought that the beautiful must necessarily also be good. True, the foremost thinkers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, sensed that the good might not coincide with beauty. Socrates expressly subordinated beauty to the good. Plato, in order to unite the two ideas, spoke of a spiritual beauty. Aristotle demanded that art affect people morally, catharsis. But even these thinkers still could not entirely renounce the notion that beauty and the good coincide. And therefore, in the language of that time, there came into use the compound word kagathia. So, kagathia, which means beautiful goodness, to signify this combined notion. So it's undeniable by Tolstoy standards that the views of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were an improvement compared to what preceded them, and that they started to approach the concept of the good expressed by Buddhism and Christianity. But because they didn't dare to go as far as sharply separating the two notions, they were confused in establishing relations between the good and beauty. Plato's judgment about beauty and the good are full of contradictions. So Tolstoy doesn't provide examples of contradictions in Plato. I would argue that not giving textual analysis of these theories that he claims are full of contradictions isn't very serious for a work that took 15 years to complete. I mean, just for the notion of catharsis, you cannot just brush it off as simply as that, as just affecting people morally and move on. It's a complicated term and its meaning is, deeply debated. The general view is that it means a moral purification by exposure to certain experiences, and that's what art does in Aristotle. But mentioning it in just one small sentence and then moving on like it doesn't really feel right, and it can mislead readers about these notions if they are not familiar with them. But we'll take Tolstoy's words for it, because explaining these notions carefully would take a very long time, and the episodes are already long enough. So the Greeks, even their, best minds, still, confuse the good and the beautiful. The people of the Greek world simply, repeated this confusion as they were imitating the Greeks. The European world, sorry, the people of the European world simply repeated this confusion as they were imitating the Greeks. But as we said, they grotesquely distorted and misrepresented them, even portrayed them as having a science of aesthetics, like we are just doing what the Greeks used to do. And since they tried to apply concepts that may meant something for the Greeks but means nothing for Christians, they only made the confusion worse. So Tolstoy says, it was this very confusion of concepts that the people of the European world, who had lost all faith, tried to make into law. They tried to prove that this combination of beauty and good lies at the very essence of the matter, that beauty and the good must coincide, that the word and concept of Kolokhonsky, which had meaning for the Greeks, but which has no meaning at all for a Christian, represents the highest ideal of mankind. Only this misunderstanding of the new science of aesthetic, on this misunderstanding, the new science of aesthetics was erected, and in order to justify this new science, the ancient teaching on art was reinterpreted in such fashion as to make it seem that this made-up science had also existed among the Greeks. So basically, these upper classes were projecting onto the Greeks their own thoughts and also their own desires. And so they argue that the ancients thought in the same way that they, the upper classes and by extension Christians, also think and see, art. But like we've shown, or as Tolstoy has shown, in fact, the reasoning of the ancients about art did not resemble ours at all. And by ours here, he means Christians, including the upper classes, who still call themselves Christians. By the way, the ancient Greeks thought had nothing, in common with how Christians, both true and church Christians and the disenchanted upper classes, the Greeks don't make a distinction between the good and the beautiful, while all Christians supposedly do. Even the upper ranks make the distinction, just like in true Christianity, the good and the beautiful don't coincide. The only difference between the upper classes and the true Christians is that the upper classes make beauty the standard of everything, including the good, to the point where at a certain moment, they completely discarded the good altogether. So this the Greek never dared to reach, and therefore the upper classes, the upper ranks, in trying to use the Greeks to justify their worldview, are simply distorting the Greeks. And it's even worse when they try to apply this to art. So according to the upper classes, the Greeks were the first in developing a science of aesthetics, a science of the beautiful, which was a poetic, the science of making art. A science of art means a science of how to achieve the beautiful in art, how to make a beautiful poem or drama, etc. But this requires first a sharp distinction between the good and the beautiful, and second, according to the beautiful, a prestigious place, giving to the beautiful a prestigious place that rivals or triumphs that of the good. So given that the Greeks had neither of these two requirements, it is simply not true that they developed a science of aesthetics. And therefore, while they never made a sharp distinction between the good and the beautiful, they made a distinction between a theory of beauty and a theory of art. Tolstoy quotes from Charles Bénard, his 1889 book, L'Esthétique d'Aristote et ses successeurs, so Aristotle's Aesthetics and his successors, saying that Bénard writes quite correctly, pour qui veut y regarder de près, la théorie du beau et celle de l'art sont tout à fait séparées dans Aristote, comme elles le sont dans Platon et chez leurs successeurs. So translation, for one who wants to look closely at it, the theory of beauty and the theory of art are completely separated in Aristotle, as they are in Plato and in their successors. So to avoid any confusion, Aristotle and Plato don't agree on art, but their divergence is limited because they both agree on this fundamental point that Tolstoy raises, meaning to separate a theory of beauty from a theory of art. Plato famously rejected art because he said that art promotes beauty, but the only real or true beauty is the good. So a theory of beauty, of genuine beauty in Plato's sense, meaning actually a theory of the good, doesn't coincide with a theory of art. What Plato wants is to teach people how to, be good and virtuous, that beauty has to be linked to morality. Since art doesn't teach morality, it cannot teach beauty. So a theory of beauty and a theory of art don't coincide. Aristotle was opposed to Plato regarding the claim that art doesn't teach morality. Instead, he argues that art can contribute to the moral formation of the individual through catharsis, but given that art has moral content, it is still distinct from a theory of beauty. So both Aristotle and Plato agree that a theory of art shouldn't be a theory of beauty, while disagreeing on the function and nature of art, and while avoiding any sharp distinction between the good and the beautiful. And therefore, the point is that despite not making the sharp distinction between the good and the beautiful, the reason of the ancient is actually closer to the true true Christianity than to the theories of art of the upper classes, of the European upper classes. So, the reasoning of the ancients on art, according to Tolstoy, not only does not confirm our aesthetics, but rather denies its teachings on beauty. And yet the upper classes and their aestheticians keep asserting with extreme confidence that there indeed was a science of the beautiful, aesthetics, initiated by the ancients Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and was supposedly continued to some extent by the Epicureans and the Stoics, Seneca, Plutarch, all up to Plotinus, but that as a result of some accident, the science somehow suddenly disappeared in the 4th century, was absent for 1500 years, and only after this gap of 1500 years was revived again in Germany in 1750 in the teaching of Baumgarten. So, this account was dogmatically held and asserted by all aestheticians, from Max Schlessler to Knight. Schlessler was an obscure German art historian, apparently, and Tolstoy included a footnote where he quotes him about that, how after Plotinus, so after the Neoplatonists, which was like the last philosophical movement of antiquity, the science of aesthetics just faded away. So like we spent 1,500 years without the slightest scientific interest in the world of beauty and art, in aesthetics and the working out of the scholarly structure of the science. But somehow it made a comeback 1,500 years later. So let's see note 49 to read the passage from Schlessler. So he says, the gap of 500 years that separates the aesthetic views of Plato and Aristotle from those of Plotinus seems astonishing. However, one cannot in fact maintain that during this period of time there had been absolutely no discussion of aesthetic questions, or that there exists a total absence of connection between the latter philosophers' views of art and those of the philosophers I have mentioned first. Though the science founded by Aristotle ceased entirely to develop further, there still occurred some interests in aesthetic questions. However, after Plotinus, the few philosophers who followed him in time, Longinus, Augustine and all, are hardly worth mentioning, being apart from everything else quite close to him in their views. Not 5 but 15 centuries went by, during which one can find no trace of scientific interest in the world of the beautiful or in art. This millennium and a half, in the course of which the word spirit in various struggles worked out entirely new forms of life, gave nothing to aesthetics in the sense of its further scientific development. So this is from the Critical History of Aesthetics by Max Schlessler. So that note is by Tolstoy himself. It's not a note added by the editors as for most of the other notes. And Tolstoy put it in German in the original text, but this is a translation by Pevear. But if you want to read it in German, you can find it in the Bloomsbury edition. So Schassler's claim that for 1500 years there were no advancements or interest in aesthetics is wrong. Not because there actually was such an interest and advancement, but because the science of aesthetics, the science of the beautiful, did not disappear and could not disappear because it never existed, as Tolstoy says, just like it never existed anywhere else in the world. The science of aesthetics is a modern European phenomenon, according to Tolstoy. The Greeks were no different from the rest of the world. Like all other nations, the Greeks simply regarded art, like any other matter, as good only when it served the good as they understood it, and bad when it was opposed to this good. So no, the Greeks didn't invent a science of aesthetics, since that requires a separation of beauty and the good. But, and this is the irony, as Tolstoy will develop when we get to the specificity of Christian art, Tolstoy too makes that distinction according to the teachings of true Christianity. Like, he'll argue that true Christianity is superior to Greek religion precisely because it separates beauty and the good. But unlike the upper classes, true Christianity and Tolstoy, they don't claim that the object of art is beauty, but more on that later. For now, let's just focus on the Greeks, on whose worldview modern European aestheticians try to erect their science by misunderstanding the same worldview they try to take as basis for their science. So he says the Greeks themselves were so little developed morally that they thought beauty and the good coincided. And on this backward worldview of the Greeks was erected the science of aesthetics, made up by men of the 18th century and especially turned into a theory by Baumgarten. The Greeks, as anyone can be convinced by reading Bernard's excellent book on Aristotle and his followers and Walter's book on Plato, never had any science of aesthetics. So Tolstoy implies that separating beauty and the good indicates a higher morality, that of true Christianity, which the Greeks lacked, but that same separation can produce something worse than even, Greek morality, an aesthetic theory of art based on beauty. So this theory started forming, in the Renaissance, after the disenchanted upper classes of the Middle Ages rejected, though not publicly, church Christianity, and reached its maturity a century and a half before Tolstoy's time, around the 18th century, among the wealthy classes of the Christian European world, simultaneously in various nations: Italian, Dutch, French, English. So appearing as a science in Germany with Baumgarten, Tolstoy marvels at how such a theory managed to take the world, the European world, by storm. The theory, he writes, was characterized by striking baselessness, and this makes it the perfect theory for the upper classes. As Tolstoy writes, no other theory ever suited so well the taste of the cultured mob, but at the same time, it is still a mystery how a theory so mediocre was adopted with such readiness and absence of criticism. Like, even for the upper classes, with their tasteless tastes, that's low. The moral bankruptcy, the flaws and the irrationality of this theory are astonishing, and yet none of them seems to be aware of how dangerous and absurd their theory is. This theory, he says, suited the taste of the upper classes so well that to this day, despite its complete arbitrariness and the non-substantiation of its thesis, it is repeated by the learned and the unlearned as something indisputable and self-evident. But I guess there is nothing else to expect from the upper classes. No theory could suit them better or represent their class. How can we explain what these classes, find intellectual? How to explain the quality of books they read, admire, and write? Well, Tolstoy says, so he says in Latin, and I'm going to butcher it because my Latin is also terrible, habent sua fata libelli pro capite lectoris. So, in Latin, that means books have their fate according to the understanding of their readers. So the Latin expression means that the fate of a book, whether it is understood, appreciated, or forgotten, depends on the reader's intellectual capacity and discernment. So clearly the upper classes didn't have much of that, as implied by Tolstoy. So the same holds for the theories developed by the upper classes. The intellectual capacity of a group or a society also determines the fate of their theories, which ones they will develop and adopt and which one they will ignore or discard. So if your society is sick, living in a state of delusion, you can already guess the quality of their theories. And for Tolstoy, the more a theory reflects the isolation of the group or class that develops it from the rest of society and developed just for providing support to that group or class's pleasures and desires, the more absurd the theory will be. And you would think that those classes, seeing how obviously false or absurd the theory is, won't embrace it. But no, you can be sure that they will embrace it. They will embrace anything that justifies their ways of life, no matter how dumb it is. So, quote, haben suafuta, the particular theories that come from the state of delusion that society is in, amidst which and for the sake of which these theories are devised. If a theory justifies the false position which a certain part of society is in, then however baseless and even obviously false the theory may be, it will get adopted and become the belief of that part of society. So Tolstoy gives two examples of baseless theories, that absurd as they are, still manage to get widespread acceptance, and I'm probably going to get angry at the second theory. So the first one is Thomas Robert Malthus's theory about the Earth's population increasing in geometrical progression, while food resources increase only in arithmetical progression, the result being the overpopulation of the Earth. So, Malthus was an English economist and Anglican pastor. He was known for his famous essay on the principles of population, published anonymously in 1798. And in it, he argues that the principal cause of poverty lies in the fact that population grows more quickly than subsistence. So the poor are poor because they pop too many babies, and it's a fate that they cannot they can't do nothing about because it's just a natural law. There has to be something that keeps population growth in check, just like in the natural world. So animals have predators, diseases and starvations as means to check the population growth. Without those, an animal population will skyrocket and thereby consume all the resources and everyone will die. And Malthus argues that the same applies to human beings. If humans reproduce uncontrollably, their population will grow faster than the Earth could provide for them. And so soon, there won't be enough resources for everyone. I mean, you will never get to a state where everyone dies because with not enough food for everyone, many people will eventually die, and so the population will decrease back to a sustainable number that matches the resources available. Okay, so you won't find a state where everyone will die. So it's like a cycle, which Malthus calls the cycle of misery. So you can probably see the danger of such a theory, politically speaking. So this theory supported views that argue that first, starvation isn't a man-made phenomenon, but is completely natural, and two, it is a good thing because it works to benefit humanity by keeping the population in check. And how convenient that the population that suffers from starvation is always and mostly the poor. What can we make of this? Well, that the poor have to put up with poverty and there is nothing we can do about it. Plus, some even went so far as to involve morality in this, but not in the sense that morality dictates that we do something about it, even if it contradicts Malthus's natural law, but to blame morally the poor. Some even say that it is God's way of punishing the poor for their moral failures. Malthus's theories were, for example, used during the Irish potato famine of 1856 to 51 to justify the death of 1 million people. Charles Trevelyan, I think that's how it is pronounced. He's a British colonial master of Ireland. He prohibited any form of aid to the starving population, not just from the British, but even from other nations. And even the farms that produced other things than potatoes in Ireland saw their crops seized and sold in Britain. And Trevelyan justified this in part through Malthus. Since the Irish population was growing and then got hit with a famine, he saw it as proof that the theory was true. And therefore he saw it as necessary that the Irish population depletes, and deplete rapidly as an act of mercy. Any aid to the Irish would simply be delaying the cycle of misery, so better kill many of them quickly to bring back the population to a stable, at a stable level as soon as possible to avoid prolonging the suffering. Like, how thoughtful. And maybe then the Irish will learn to behave virtuously and stop having sex that much, because that's a problem for him. You know, not the physical evil of famine, but the moral evil of the wicked and promiscuous poor. So this theory is obviously false and outdated. There is no such thing as natural famines. All could have been avoided and were man-made. And it's never about population growth, much as resource distribution and management. So those who like to roll with Malthusianism are basically privileged assholes who want to keep their power over others by, controlling access to resources and look for ways to justify that. It's no different from the reasons why the upper classes adopted the theories of art we criticize here. It justifies their judgment and supports their social position and power over others, and that's it. And therefore, it's no wonder that Tolstoy hates this theory and exposes it as false, just like he rejects all social Darwinist theories. I mean, you can easily see how Malthusianism can merge with social Darwinism, the idea that Darwin's theory, notably survival of the fittest, applies also to society. The poor need to die so that the population of the geniuses, which of course always happen to be among the upper classes, thrives. You can also, you can call these theories variations of the selection and the struggle for existence as the basis of human progress. So this is, the theory based on Malthus. Like in the name of progress, we select whose life is worth living and preserving and whose isn't. And here Tolstoy brings in the second theory that he also considers false and So he says, such too is the now widely spread theory of Marx, that economic progress is inevitable and consists in the swallowing up of all private enterprises by capitalism. So he had to drag Marx into this, as if Marxism was an elite theory widely accepted in the upper classes of European and Russian society. But sure, if you reduce Marxism to just, the claim that economic progress is first inevitable and two, it consists in the swallowing up of all private enterprises by capitalism, you make it sound like there is nothing to be done about it and it's, somehow good, since at the end of this progressive process we get to communism. So it is fine if capitalism swallows up all private enterprises. It's what, economic progress requires to get to communism, so it's worth it. But first, this is a grotesque simplification of Marxism, contrary to Malthus, whose theory is really, that grotesque, and Marx even attacks and refutes Malthus. And second, I made a whole podcast on how Marx rethought many of his ideas, especially, during the last 15 years of his life. What Tolstoy is referring here is Marx's productivism and the linear progressive view of history, which Marx eventually abandoned and argued for a more direct and sustainable transition to communism without having to go through capitalism. So the podcast is on the book Slow Down by Kohei Saito. Anyway, so the point is that the upper classes, they give no shits. They'll happily endorse any idea or theory as long as it benefits them without caring about its content or ethical implications. However baseless, he says, theories of this sort may be, however contradictory they may be to everything mankind knows and recognizes, however obviously immoral they may be, they are accepted on faith, without criticism, and are preached with passionate enthusiasm, sometimes for centuries, until the conditions they justify are done away with or the absurdity of their theories become too obvious. So just like they don't care about the ethics and the logic of the political theories that they embrace, we don't see why things would be different when it comes to aesthetic theories. Just like Malthusian theories, and as it pains me to say it, the Marxist theories, Tolstoy, you tool, what are you doing? Are taken for granted like scriptures, so too the aesthetic theories of Baumgarten and his followers. They're also blind that they don't even see that they are so blind that they don't even see that they contradict themselves, by the way. On the one hand, the Greeks had the science of aesthetics, which requires separation of the beautiful and the good, and on the other, they fail to see that separation. So this has to be one of the greatest ironies of, in the history of ideas. They put the good and the beautiful as aspect of the same concepts, the absolute, but in the end they simply subordinate the good to the beautiful. So the astonishing theory of Baumgarten's Trinity, God, good, truth, and beauty, is actually a theory that says, don't worry about the good. If what you do is beautiful, then it is good and it is true. So just focus on beauty, on whatever pleases your senses. The two other notions will follow, trust me. So according to Tolstoy, this is how a savage thinks. He only evaluates the good according to what's pleasing to him. So according to Baumgarten's theory, it turns out that the best that can be done by the art of peoples who have lived 1800 years of Christian life is to adopt as its ideal the same one that was held by a small half-savage slave-owning people 2,000 years ago who portrayed naked human bodies very well and built buildings pleasing to the eye. No one notices any of these incongruities. Learned men write long, vaporous treatises on beauty, and one member of the aesthetic trinity, the beautiful, the true, the good, das Schöne, das Wahre, das Gute, le beau, le vrai, le bon, with capital letters, are repeated by philosophers, aestheticians, artists, private individuals, novelists, pamphleteers, and everyone seems to think that in pronouncing these sacramental words, they are speaking of something quite definite and firm, something on which one can base one's judgments. In fact, these words not only have no definite meaning, but they hinder us from giving any definite meaning to existing art, and are needed only to justify the false significance we ascribe to art that conveys all sorts of feelings, so long as these feelings afford us pleasure. So this is also interesting to know the parallel between Christian Trinity and Baumgarten's Trinity. As Tolstoy argued, the Trinity isn't a teaching found in true Christianity, but is a church teaching. It's a church invention. And perhaps if we are failing to see the absurdity of Baumgarten's Trinity is precisely because it is associated with the church's Trinity. We've argued that the masses were on board with the church's teachings, and so we shouldn't think that church Christianity is a form of Christianity for the elite, but the people kept believing in true Christianity. No, the masses also embraced the Trinity. The few sects who opposed it were minorities and were heavily suppressed. So the Trinity was taken as legit by everyone, and so it is perhaps for this reason that they fail to see the aesthetic theories for what they are. It's out of the habit of regarding this Trinity, Baumgarten's, as having the truth of the religious Trinity. So just like people became accustomed to the belief that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one and the same, and because they are accustomed to that belief, they also see that the good, the beautiful, and the true as also the same, and fail to see that they are not. But the moment they, or we in the text, renounce that habit and ask ourselves what we always understand as the meaning of the three words of this Trinity, we will be convinced beyond doubt of how utterly fantastic is the uniting of these three utterly different and above all incommensurate words and concepts. The good, the beautiful, and the true are put on the same level, and all three concepts are recognized as fundamental and metaphysical, yet the reality is nothing of the sort. So now we need to see what makes them different and can't be put on the same level. We need to be conscious about this separation as the true Christianity prescribed, and not unconscious about it like the upper classes. Like I said, the upper classes, they make a distinction between the good and the beautiful and also the true, but the distinction is unconscious, and so they end up speaking of a trinity of the three concepts when in reality they are just only speaking about the beautiful. So let's start with the good. How does Tolstoy defines it? Well, here it is. The good is the eternal, the highest aim of our life. No matter how we understand the good, our life is nothing else than a striving towards the good, that is, towards God. The good is indeed a fundamental concept, which metaphysically constitutes the essence of our consciousness, a concept undefinable by reason. The good is that which no one can define, but which defines everything else. So I always love it how religious people tell you that the aim of life is striving towards the good, no matter how you understand it, and then they hit you with, it's God. But whatever. Let's just agree that everyone has, the good in their life as something that they strive towards. For Tolstoy and theists, that's God, and as a classical theist mover, they imply that it's the same for everyone. Everyone strives towards God. The good, however, is a fundamental concept. Fundamental means that it is the starting point for everything. So you cannot theorize or define the good, rather the good determines how you theorize and define everything else. It's the very condition of the activity of theorizing and defining. And as such, it cannot be grasped by reason since it is the condition of reasoning. So that's why it is fundamental. You start with it without really knowing what it is. So it's also a metaphysical concept, as in it's the essence of consciousness, since without the good there would be no point to consciousness. But it's also a metaphysical notion in another sense, that is, it is independent. Like this one, we will explain now when we get to the point, to the notion of truth. For now, we say that the good is both fundamental and a metaphysical concept. However, the same cannot be said about beauty, which for Tolstoy is opposed to the good, and the closer we get to the beautiful, the further we stray away from the good, and vice versa. But the beautiful, he says, if we are not to content ourselves with words, but speak of what we understand, the beautiful is nothing other than what is pleasing to us. The concept of beauty not only does not coincide with the good, but is rather the opposite of it, because the good, for the most part, coincides with a triumph over our predilections, while beauty is the basis for all our predilections. The more we give ourselves to beauty, the more removed we are from the good. Now, this doesn't mean that what is good cannot also be pleasant, as Tolstoy himself said in the second chapter, when discussing, the Russian language. The good can include the beautiful, and if the beautiful is pleasant, then the good can include what is pleasant. But the good must always have the priority, and for it to have the priority, we must be detached from the beautiful. It's like if you get something pleasant out of the good, that's just an accidental bonus. What matters is that you achieve the good. So from the good you can get something beautiful because it is good. Some things can be beautiful because they are good, but nothing can be good because they are beautiful. You can derive pleasure from the good, but you can never derive the good from pleasure. And so to be able to reach the good, you need to be able to tame whatever drives you towards pleasure. And that's why the good is opposed to the beautiful, to pleasure. Not because you can never have both, but that the only way to reach the good is by being willing and ready to give up on the beautiful, to give up on pleasure. Like you need to get to the point where you say, pleasure doesn't matter. Plus the moment where you have both are rare anyways. And when they happen, the experience of beauty there almost certainly never coincides with the experience of beauty as usually understood as just pleasure. If experiencing the good comes with a certain pleasure, that pleasure is so unique that it can hardly resemble usual pleasure, if it is pleasure at all. So this is, for example, when people speak of a moral and spiritual beauty to contradict Tolstoy. They refer to this notion to mean that beauty and the beautiful can coincide, but Tolstoy retorts that it is only a play on words, for the reasons that we just mentioned. Because by spiritual or moral beauty, we mean nothing other than the good. Spiritual beauty, or the good, for the most part, not only does not coincide with what is usually meant by beauty, but is the opposite of it. So even if you want to settle for this spiritual beauty, you need to be, predisposed to abandon pleasure. No one can value beauty as the aestheticians do and expect to experience spiritual or moral beauty. So again, spiritual beauty is just another word for the good. That's some mistake for something else. So that's it for the definitions of good and beautiful. The good, by the way, cannot be defined, and it is fundamental and metaphysical, whereas beauty isn't. We can define it. It's neither, fundamental nor metaphysical, to the disappointment of the German idealists, and both concepts are in complete opposition to one another. The last concept that remains of the Trinity is truth. Now, obviously, with beauty and the good, we explained why they cannot be identified with one another. The same holds for the notion of truth. It is still less possible to assign to this member of the supposed Trinity not only a oneness with the good or the beautiful, but even an independent existence at all. So here, let's start with the similarities between beauty and truth. Both cannot be confused with the good, and both lack an independent existence at all, meaning that they are not metaphysical. There is no such a thing as beauty as such, detached from the world and the pleasant sensation of a subject, and likewise with truth. There is no truth as such, contrary to the good, which can exist as such, as enjoying an independent existence. Truth is, in Tolstoy's words, only the correspondence between the manifestation or definition of an object and its essence, or the understanding of the object common to all people. As such, truth is conditional. When there is a correspondence between an object's definition and the object's essence, we can call that truth, or if the correspondence between the object's definitions and the understanding of the object common to everyone. Now, there is something strange because in the Pevear translation, you have a correspondence with the essence, whereas in most translation, the original first translation, it's correspondence with reality. So it's unclear whether by reality we mean essence or just how the object appears empirically, but Tolstoy doesn't seem to care that much because such technicality, he doesn't care much about, technicalities like this, since he puts it on par with conventional understanding. A claim about an object is true if it corresponds with how the object is generally understood by everyone. So the judgment of others, the majority, determines what is true. So here we see why truth isn't independent. It actually depends on how people understand the things they want to speak truth about. And therefore, truth, like beauty, doesn't have an independent existence contrary to the good. They are neither metaphysical nor fundamental, and therefore, as Tolstoy says, the concept of beauty and truth not only are not equal with the good, not only are not of one essence with the good, but do not even coincide with it. But that's as far as the similarities go between truth and beauty. It's clear that they are similar in relation to the good and cannot be confused with the good, but that doesn't mean that they are the same thing. Truth and beauty also require distinctions. Because the truth is either correspondence between the manifestation and the essence of the object, or reality of the object depending on the translation, or between the manifestation, definition, and conventional understanding, truth requires some distance from pleasure. Truth requires us that we act against pleasure. Right? It imposes limits and efforts from us. You cannot claim the truth about something if sticking to it goes against certain pleasures that you are unwilling to give up. So it already demands restraints on your part. You cannot speak of things that you know are contrary to reality, to the essence of objects, just because sticking to truth is painful or discomforting. And likewise with the criterion of conventional, understanding. The truth forces you into agreeing with others. So it's a way to keep your ego in check, and hence you keep your drives towards pleasures in check. And as such, if truth doesn't coincide with the good, it is still at least one means of attaining the good. So it is closer to the good than beauty is. But in itself, truth is neither the good nor the beautiful and does not even coincide with them. And within that means of attaining the good, then there are degrees. Some means are more efficient than others in attaining the good, while some are completely discordant with it. Tolstoy mentions philosophers, Tolstoy and Blaise Pascal, for whom a knowledge of the truth of useless objects are discordant with the good. So, for Socrates, knowledge that doesn't aim at the well-being of the city, or at least of the individual, is useless as such, it's incompatible with the good. Whereas for Pascal, if knowledge doesn't get you closer to God, it is useless, and yes, that eventually included mathematics. But that's just it. Useless knowledge is still truth. And so truth as just a means towards the good is not the good. You can know only truths, right? You can avoid all falsehood, but if all you know is useless truths, that won't help you attain the good. And even if what you know is useful, that still doesn't guarantee either that you will attain to the good. After all, learned people can be assholes too, and those Tolstoy criticized throughout this work are precisely learned people. So for the truth to attain the good, it needs the good. On its own, it cannot do shit. And so that wraps it up for truth. Obviously, with what we said, it is clear that truth has nothing in common with beauty and is for the most part opposed to it. While the truth doesn't necessarily coincide with the good, it doesn't coincide with beauty either. Even if your knowledge is just about useless stuff, or you are not using it for the good, the fact that what you possess as knowledge is true means that you are not after beauty either. So truth by its own nature is against deception and is actively trying to avoid it and combat it. And in that combat, while exposing the deception, truth destroys illusion, the main condition of beauty. If what you want is the truth, even though that doesn't mean that you are after the good, it means that you are willing to accept that truth, even if it is an ugly or harsh truth. So obviously all these three notions aren't the same and cannot be understood as the same. But that's precisely what the aestheticians did. They performed the arbitrary uniting of these three incommensurate and mutually alien concepts. And out of this unity came the most absurd theory of art in all of mankind's history, that again, even the Greeks, on whom they claim to base this theory, never dared to think about it, never dared to conceive it. True, the Greeks, according to Tolstoy, were morally inferior to Christians and were half savages, as were the rest of the worlds, of course. But this theory is even more backwards. The upper classes are more savage than the Greeks. The Greeks, again, like any other civilization, including church Christianity, confused to some extent the three notions, but just to a healthy dose. They still ground the difference between good and bad art according to the feelings that art conveys, which they consider good and which they consider, bad, as all of humanity used to do. But that theory of the difference between good art conveying good feelings and bad art conveying wicked feelings was totally obliterated. And one of the lowest manifestations of art, art for mere pleasure, against which all teachers of mankind have warned people, came to be regarded as the highest art. And art became not the important thing it was intended to be, but the empty amusement of idle people. And with this, we finish chapter 7, and so we conclude this episode. So we went through 5, 6, and 7, and next week, starting from chapter 8, we are going to spend some time, probably 2 weeks, talking about specifically this new form of art, this art that emerged from the upper classes, and it's called counterfeit art. So we're going to spend the next week seeing the characteristics of counterfeit art, and the week after we're going to see the causes of counterfeit art and also its consequences. So that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. As always, like the video, write a comment, share it, support me on on social media.